He'll be talking about the fidelity principle in practice, and as we talk about all these changes to line up with best practice recommendations, it really kind of begs that next question of how do we implement that? How do we make that happen? How do we train staff? How do we assure fidelity to the model? And so what Darin's going to talk about here is really important for making those changes stick and getting the results that we're looking for.
Thank you. We're on here. Can you guys hear me okay? Doing all right? Okay, good. I was hoping to not stay behind the podium here and be able to speak a little bit as I walked around, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thanks to Jennifer and to Rob for the invitation to share with you a little bit about what we've learned at Weber Human Services around fidelity, and probably more than that, around implementing what works. And this is just kind of one small area related to that. I do want to start by telling you that I feel great today. This is, I just do. I feel really good, and I'll tell you why. About 2 weeks ago, I noticed, I get up in the morning and I run, and I noticed that I was having some back pain. And thought, wow, I just really need to stretch this out. And so each day, it kind of progressively got worse. And I was stretching, and I was thinking, wow, I've got to sleep differently. And then Thursday night, I figured out, okay, this is not back pain. There is something going on here. And Friday morning, I became the proud parent of my first kidney stone. And I just couldn't have been more proud. And so I am feeling great today. That's what I want to tell you to start out with. But anyway, it really is a great opportunity and a privilege to be here with you as we move forward this idea of really making a difference in Utah. This group really, you may not think you do, but you do. You have the capacity, and you're in the position to influence outcomes that affect lots of people. People aren't necessarily going to come up to you someday and say, hey, thank you, I wasn't robbed yesterday, or my child wasn't harmed. It doesn't really work that way, but as collectively, as we reduce crime in our communities, there are a lot of people who are affected by that in a very positive way. So the first thing I wanted to do today, and we're going to move quickly, and I'm going to try and leave some time at the end for some questions. See if I can move this and not hit it. I don't think we can really talk about recidivism reduction without talking about Andy Griffith and Barney Fife. The real forerunners of recidivism reduction were these two great people. So let me see if I can show you quickly a little short clip. Ooh, I hope I can. We were up and running a moment ago. Let's see here. Let's try this. We'll see. I'll try and get back to it. Oh. We won't watch all 30 minutes. Although this is a classic episode. You'd probably like that, but we're just going to watch a real brief clip here. And here is the criminal.
Founders Day pageant. And listen, I don't think I'll show up. Well, I want to revisit one of their stores. There are a few more things I want to pick up.
Sure, it's taken him a long time to freshen up.
Well, at least in his own hotel room, he can't do much damage.
Let's see if we can get any more volume we can get. I don't want you to miss this teaching moment here. We're about there. Oh no, that's good. All right, let's try this.
You know, Andy, it's a shame about these fellows who steal.
Yeah, they all have to do that.
I was reading an article about it in one of the police magazines. Kleptomaniacs, they call it.
What?
Kleptomaniacs.
What's a kleptomaniac?
person steals because he can't help it. It's a sickness.
I don't believe I've ever seen one.
You know what they do living in prison? Well, they have a rehabilitation program where they, you know, talk to them a lot, and they let them read books, and they have them make these baskets. You know, when they're released, why they can be useful citizens.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, it's amazing what they can do to straighten these fellows out just with a little talk. You know, they just show them right from wrong, point out the error of their ways, and tell them it's just wrong to steal.
And them baskets and things, that cures them, huh?
Because they're sick.
Oh, excuse me, Chief. Floyd, what are you doing here?
All right, well, there you have it. So, fidelity to what? Yeah, fidelity to the Barney Fife evidence-based intervention, I think, is what we're talking about here. You have seen over and over and over again, I'm assuming that you have in some ways because this has been around for a while, this list of kind of the short list of what works. There's more to it than that, but I thought if we spent one more session on that, we would have a room full of this. In fact, I think this was me in my research class here at U. Sorry. Doug introduced me as a researcher. I'm a consumer of research, but I struggled with it in grad school. But I really have come to thoroughly enjoy and be moved by the research around what works. But we've talked a lot about it. We've talked about these ideas of the need principle, and we've talked about the risk principle, and we've talked about using models that work, and we've talked about using them in a responsive way and delivering them to fidelity. But what we don't spend a lot of time talking about is how to make it work. So I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't keep talking about what works, but we need to really come to terms with the fact that knowing what works and making it work are very, very different things. And this is the short list of questions, and I'm not going to go through those, but as you look at this list of questions, these are the kind of things that organizations are faced with right now. You can give us money, you can give us training in things, but the reality is that neither of those in and of themselves will result in better outcomes for our communities. We've got to get better at making this work, and really the reality is this. This is what it looks like to take what works and make it work. It's a juggling act, and you have to be able to look at multiple points within your own organization and see how they're going to be affected as you move forward. So that's what we're going to be talking about today is how do we make this work? I was asked specifically to speak on one element, and that is this idea of fidelity in coaching, but it really is one element, and you need to at least be exposed to the fact that it sits within a broader confinement of how do we, as individuals delivering services or intervening, many of you, maybe that's not your role, you don't see yourself as an interventionist, but the reality is in some form you probably are. But how do we get better at what we do so that we're using what works and making it work for the offender? So we can talk about fidelity in coaching, but we have to be able to identify and hire people who are coachable. We could spend a lot of time on that. I don't have time to do that, but if coaching and fidelity matters, then people who are open to that matter. And we've got to have the right people in place. Doug talked about training. We have to train differently. There's a lot of research on training that makes a difference and training that really doesn't. And we've got to get better at training. But training in and of itself is it's like, sometimes I use the analogy, training is to outcomes what chocolate chip cookies are to or what chocolate chips are to chocolate chip cookies. Just because you have a handful of chocolate chips does not make a chocolate chip cookie. It's necessary, but it's insufficient. Training is necessary, but insufficient. These fidelity processes matter, and then we've got to have performance assessment. We need to know if what we're doing is really working. And as you build these in, the right people trained well, effectively coached and outcome-driven, you start to see reliable benefits occur. But it's only within this process of the right people trained well, effectively coached, who are outcome-driven, and we have some performance measurement processes. So this is how we develop competency in using what works. And we're going to talk about one element of that. To drive home the point about this idea of fidelity, this is a slide you'll want to take to parties. This will make you just so popular if you show up and start talking about this. This was an interesting study done by a guy out of Vanderbilt University, Dr. Mark Lipsey, and he has the largest database of juvenile justice studies in the world. So he's coded hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these studies on what works to reduce crime in juvenile justice. And at one point he said, okay, we're going to take and group these, the very best models that reduce recidivism, and that's what you have on this column, group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4. These were the things that were really reducing recidivism. And he said, now I'm going to divide these, and I'm going to divide these by those that had fidelity processes in place and were focused on the quality of what they were doing. And what he found was fascinating. He found that the best programs that had low quality were achieving the same outcomes as poorer quality or programs that were performing not as well, but did have quality measures in place. So some people could say, well, just take good programs and you could do them poorly and get the same outcomes as poor programs, but that's not what we're looking for. It's the converse of that. The opposite of that is whatever you do, do it well. Do it with fidelity. That's what he showed. Those programs that seemed to be a little less effective actually had the same outcomes as some of these better programs if quality was in place. So building on that, this has been a couple of months ago. I picked up just a research journal that was on my desk. And I looked for the first randomized control trial I could find in this. It was the Journal of Substance Abuse. And I knew what I would find already because I've looked at these many times. And this was a study done, and it showed that in this randomized control trial, the treatment that they were testing outperformed treatment as usual, right? We've seen these over and over again. So this was looking at abstinence rates, and sure enough, this well-designed treatment was outperforming treatment as usual in abstinence rates. And we go, wow, that's fascinating, that's interesting. So whatever they were doing, that's what I want to do. Well, when you look into the study, and this happens every time you dig in, here's what you find happened. First of all, the treatment was manual guided. So the treatment that was being delivered that they were studying, it was manualized. Next, they were trained for 40 hours. It wasn't this kind of training either, and we don't have time to talk about that, but it's a more intense kind of an approach to training. And then finally, the therapists participated in ongoing weekly supervision that include review of their taped therapy sessions. You see, when we see a study like this, what we want to say is, wow, the ingredients of that treatment must be very effective. Well, they potentially are, but how the people were trained who delivered it mattered as much. Does that make sense? Do you understand where I'm going with this? How much of this occurs in our organizations? So they say, oh, okay, well, we're going to adopt this model of treatment. This is what we want to do. Are we going to adopt the same processes that were part of the study? Are we going to use the manual? Are we going to get intensive training? Are we going to get weekly supervision that involves ongoing coaching and a direct observation of our work? If that doesn't exist in our organization, it really doesn't matter how good the interventions actually were because we're not using them the way they were put in place in research. So what's happening in your organization? When I started at Weaver Human Services a long time ago, there was a period of time where I used to tell people, and now it's starting to make me feel old, so I don't. It's been a while. When I started there, my supervision looked like this. I went to my supervisor and we sat down and we talked, and I would tell him about the cases that were really challenging to me. They were bothering me, and I was struggling with them, and so we would talk, and I would tell him, and we called it a case staffing. And he, from his own wisdom and years of experience, would give me some ideas and some suggestions, and then I would leave his office. And, you know, it was kind of an exchange of stories that occurred. And that was the supervision model. And that supervision model, to a degree, exists today. And I'm not saying that all case staffing is bad or wrong, but the reality is we have no evidence to suggest that storytelling in supervision improves performance. That talking about cases makes a big difference in our own performance in delivering things that work. And so at Weber Human Services, we've really tried to move from a place of storytelling to a place of skill mastery. And there's a lot of reasons to do this, but it's been challenging, and that's what I want to share with you today, is this idea of moving from this kind of apprentice approach. I'm the apprentice, and I go to my master clinician, and he imparts wisdom and advice to me, and somehow magically I become a better therapist, to a place where I go into supervision, and my supervisor says, look, I think you're pretty good at this, but I still think there's room for practice and growth. And I think we could work and improve and make some real progress at this. And we practice together during supervision. We're actually engaged in a practice process that might matter. Okay? So, real quick, let's talk about why this matters. This is a meta-analysis done on teachers and the effects of teaching. We have a ton of evidence to show us what works in teaching. And what they did with this is they looked at training components. And they said if you show up to a training and you get theory, you get a theory and discussion, about 10% of the people are going to walk away knowing what was talked about there. So you show up to a training and they talk about the theory, that's what you're going to get. If they add to that demonstration and training, so you come, we not only talk about the theory, but now somebody demonstrates it, that goes up to 30% who know it, 20% who can do it, but no one uses it in the classroom. If someone shows us how during the training. Now, if we add to that practice and feedback, during the training, you asked me to practice and you told me when I was doing it wrong and doing it right, and I now know that, look at the jump. 60% know it, 60% can do it, 5% use it in the classroom. Do you see the disconnect? Really good training makes a difference, but it doesn't always get it to the people who need it. But when they added coaching in the classroom, direct observation, so at the end of the day, I sat in with the teacher and I gave that teacher feedback and said, here's what you did really well, here's where you need to improve. Now, 95% know it, 95% can do it, and 95% of them are doing it in the classroom. I would tell you that this is translatable to our field. That these numbers would not look much different in our field if we were to have this kind of data. This is a great quote from Bill Miller, one of the original developers of motivational interviewing, and he says that as you try and learn skills that matter, evidence-based practice approaches, it's like if you're trying to do this without some kind of feedback, it's like bowling in the dark. Now, I'm not talking about bowling in the dark like with disco ball. This is pitch black, right? I can't see anything. I could hear something. I could hear a gutter ball. I could hear the ball hitting some pins, but I don't know how good I'm doing. I may be knocked down 2. I may be knocked down 9. I don't know. That's how it is to learn any type of evidence-based practice approach without ongoing feedback. It's bowling in the dark. And I could, if we had time, I could show you a great bit of data that we have gathered at Weber Human Services that shows the disconnect between what clinicians sometimes perceive in their use of motivational interviewing and what was actually observed in motivational interviewing through direct observation. Those things can be very different, and without pulling them together, we don't see a lot of progress in skill development and in clients. And we can use these terms differently, clients, individuals you're working with, offenders, whatever term you want to use, we don't see them getting the service that would make the difference in reducing recidivism. So I'm not going to speak a lot about what constitutes fidelity evaluations. I don't have a lot of time there, but you can look at kind of what that is. It should serve two purposes, and this is what really matters. When we do fidelity evaluations, we didn't understand this in the beginning, but it has to be able to shape individual performance. I can't pat myself on the back as a supervisor because I sat in and I did a fidelity evaluation of MRT. That's great. Did it affect anyone's performance going forward? It's got to shape individual performance, and it's got to shape overall practice improvement strategies. So the frequency with which I'm doing fidelity evaluations then begins to shape practice. So as a supervisor, if I'm doing fidelity evaluations of moral recognition therapy, over time I see patterns in our organization. Here's where we're falling short. And now I can train to those patterns, right? I can go back and look at the last year of fidelity data and say, wow, in motivational interviewing, and this is exactly what we saw. We had over 1,300 fidelity reviews of motivational interviewing, and when we looked at it collectively, what we saw was our clinicians were doing a great job of reflecting, using open-ended questions, affirmations. They were doing kind of those things that are important to MI, but not necessarily the advanced skills that create change. And so then we could begin to train to that. So that's the idea behind fidelity evaluations. Here are concerns that come up, right? And this is the short list. There's a whole bunch of concerns. As you begin doing fidelity evaluations, it doesn't matter what organization you're in. APMP, they're using the RIM, the incentive plan. As you try and roll that out, it's going to get done in 100 different ways. As many people as you have, it's going to get done in 100 different ways, and you're going to have to find a way to get to a place where people are doing it consistently as it was designed. But as you move in that direction, you're going to hear these concerns. So as we implemented a direct observation process in our organization, something new was introduced into the room, and that was an audio recorder. So we have the client sign a release, and the clinician now presses the record button. What does that do to the process? I remember some of the first ones I taped. I was being certified in motivational interviewing. We had to send off our tapes nationally to be listened to, and I turned that recorder on, and at the end, I turned it off, and this is a young man I'd been working with for a long period of time in a juvenile drug court setting, and he said to me, are you going to talk weird like that all the time going forward? I mean, that was kind of weird. So, good. Well, that went over great. You introduce these new elements and you have to accommodate, and we've had clinicians tell us, I feel like I'm performing every time I turn on the recorder. Well, that has implications. Lots of implications. We don't have time to talk about those, but these are some of the things that we hear as we talk about doing fidelity evaluations and introducing that into our work. But as I said before, this is the work that matters. That slide you're taking to your next party, it was quality that was driving much of what was resulting in good outcomes, not just the intervention itself. This is a great quote. I really like this, and this is the idea. This idea that deliberate practice means setting aside time for reflecting on feedback received, identifying where one's performance falls short, seeking guidance from recognized experts, and developing, rehearsing, executing, and evaluating a plan for improvement. That's hard, but that's the difference. And so what we've noticed is that we have about 70 clinicians in our organization. But clinicians who have this kind of attitude about fidelity evaluations, so remember, we could just say, hey, at our organization, we're going to do fidelity evaluations. We're going to come in and we're going to observe and we're going to give you feedback. And the clinician can go, that's really nice, thank you, but I'm not doing anything with it. They may not say that out loud, but it's not like there's necessarily some type of coercion process in getting them to do something with fidelity evaluation information. But the research is clear that those clinicians who have that attitude, and this would go again to anyone who's receiving feedback in your work, that openness to it, that experience of acknowledging mistakes, those who acknowledge mistakes are the best performers. This is true among any field, in sports, in professional, in a variety of professions. Those who are willing to recognize and look for and acknowledge mistakes are the ones who are outperforming others consistently. How could that be? The one who's making mistakes and acknowledging them is the one who's outperforming, because they're constantly evaluating their success. They're constantly looking for ways to get better. And what does that do? It translates into job satisfaction. It may not seem so. When you introduce fidelity evaluation, well, you're going to look over my shoulder? You're going to tell me I'm doing this wrong? That doesn't make me feel like I like my job very much. It's not about that. And that attitude then begins to really produce, and in fact, I'll show you a slide in a few minutes, it really begins to produce some changes for that individual in terms of their job satisfaction. Ultimately, nuts and bolts, here's what you're trying to accomplish when it comes to this process. We want to take what works, we want to get trained in it, and we want to begin delivering it. We want to conduct direct observations of that using some type of instrument that's been designed to help us know when we're seeing what works and when we're not seeing what works. So we want to provide feedback. Skill-focused feedback is provided timely and effectively. If I'm telling you about a fidelity evaluation I did 6 months ago, you're not going to remember that. It's got to be done timely, and it's got to be skill-focused. It doesn't help to come in and tell me, well, you did that wrong. You've got to tell me where I did it wrong, and you've also got to tell me what I did well, what I did right, so I can keep doing that, right? Yes? It says results of incorporated feedback observed and reported. So there was a time when we were doing this and we felt like, oh, wow, we're doing great. We're doing direct observation, we're providing feedback, and we're focusing on skills. But the reality is that from that, you've got to develop a plan to incorporate it going forward, right? So if I was using motivational interviewing last week and you now tell me, Darin, you need to really work on some change planning and you need to develop discrepancies better, you give me that feedback, I now need a plan to move that forward. Okay, great. I've got another session tomorrow and I can use that. I can record it. You can listen to it and tell me if that's exactly what's happening. So this second part of the feedback loop matters because now results are incorporated, and my supervisor has observed that and told me, you did just that, Darin. You were working well on developing discrepancies. You did some change planning. That was nicely done. Keep that up. And in the process, they were observing me and giving me more feedback, and this begins to spin. And as this begins to spin within organizations, what happens is the quality of the service begins to improve. And now we're taking what works and we're making it work in an organization. And I'm going to talk a little bit about organizations and how hard that is. It's kind of hard to get there. The only thing harder than getting there, to be real honest, is staying there. We'll talk about that for a minute too. But let's talk about a quality supervision session. I talked about storytelling versus skill mastery. Fidelity evaluation work happens between the person who did the fidelity evaluation and the person getting the feedback. And what should that look like? At Weber Human Services, this is where we're headed and where we hope to get and what we want to have happen. We see it happening to a degree. By the way, I'll tell you this, that we don't just have a clinician record their session, we have supervisors record their supervision sessions. And we look for this from the supervisors, and we give the supervisors feedback about how well they're giving feedback. Because we want to improve in this process of having supervisors deliver this. And I won't spend a lot of time here, but you've got a quality supervisory relationship matters. It's got to be person-centered. I've got to, the clinician, the direct line worker, I hope you're translating there. When I say clinician, this can be anybody who's in a position in which they can get feedback related to their performance, there's got to be this idea of a quality supervision relationship that focuses on the person, performance, and purpose. If you're giving me feedback outside the context of the purpose of my job, I don't care how much you're paying me, I'm not going to like it. I've got to feel like there's purpose and meaning to the work that I'm doing. That's why we got into this business. That's what we're looking for. There's a structure of supervision that occurs, and there are supervision strategies that happen within that structure. And that's what we're hoping to happens with fidelity evaluations. Now, when I use that word hope, right, that's back to the same thing. We can train and hope. That's been our old strategy. I got trained in aggression replacement training or thinking for a change, and I hope I'm doing it. Well, we need to move beyond hope. We need to see it. We need to know that that's what clients are getting. That's what the offenders are getting, is thinking for a change as it was tested in the research. And the same is true in the fidelity process. We need to be more than hoping that fidelity is occurring. We need to make it happen, and this is kind of the process that it does. By the way, we're going to have some time right at the end for questions. I'm happy to revisit any of these slides. So this is what we want to see happen. This was a great email I got about a year ago. My role is to work with the supervisors to see that this happens. And this is just what we want to have happen. And think about it. As you read that comment, how is this person feeling about fidelity processes at Weber Human Services? Now, I can't say that everyone feels this way. I can't say that everyone gets exactly this kind of an experience. We hope to. We want to move in that direction, and we're working hard at it. But is there a sense that this person is liking their job? I think so. Yes, he pointed out I didn't know what I was doing at one point in the video. So this person is using a treatment model in which we're not just audio recording, we're video recording to do fidelity evaluations. So the supervisor and this person in a group setting are sitting down and watching this video. And during the group supervision, the supervisor points out, the clinician's name is Jane. She won't mind me sharing that with you. She's a great clinician, but he points out to Jane, it looks like you don't know what you're doing here. But she said he did it in such a way that we had a good laugh. I had a big aha moment, and his feedback increased my desire to get out there and try it again. That's motivation. That's purpose and meaning in your work. That's what we want to have happen over time. And we want that experience to be for each person who's getting fidelity feedback. So, this is a study that was done several years ago in the state of Oklahoma, in which they trained all family preservation workers in an evidence-based practice. Family preservation was my first job after I left graduate school here. It's really hard work, but they randomized these people into 4 groups. There was a group that got the evidence-based practice plus monitoring. That's the term they used in the study. Monitoring meaning coaching. Evidence-based practice, no monitoring. Treatment as usual plus monitoring. You're going to keep doing your job the same way you did. You're not going to get trained in the evidence-based practice, but we're now going to add in coaching. And treatment as usual, no monitoring. And then they tracked all family preservation workers in the state of Oklahoma for 3 years to see how long they stayed in their job. How could that be? That is a dramatic difference, right? It's a dramatic difference between the evidence-based practice and coaching and the treatment as usual with no coaching. Nearly 60% of those people stayed in their job for 3 years. Why is that? It's that slide before. It's this sense that I'm good at my job. That's what fidelity monitoring can do. And that coaching process is that I feel like I'm improving and I'm getting better at my work and it's becoming meaningful to me. All of them had the same hard job, but that group stayed. Larger percentage stayed. Okay, so we've talked about this idea of the fidelity driver. That's what we sometimes call it, the fidelity driver, the coaching driver within organizations. But it's the organization itself that starts to really make a difference as to whether or not this happens. Here are the principal problems with this. So I hope that you're feeling some interest, some level of motivation to have fidelity processes begin working within your organization. But here's what you're going to run into. That mid-level supervisor's role, who are typically doing fidelity evaluations, doesn't always have to be that way, but it happens in most organizations. That mid-level supervisor role was created, 2 to 3 decades ago, when we had this wasn't even part of the equation. That's a huge problem for us. Priorities for supervisors, they get mixed messages, and I could show you some interesting data on our supervisors and what they told us about what was important to them in their jobs. Basically what they told us is everything is important and I spend a little bit of time doing it. So if everything's important, nothing's really important. That's kind of the definition, right? So that's a huge issue, and supervisors, frankly, this whole fidelity piece is hard. It's hard work. It creates some different dynamics between supervisors and supervisees, and it becomes harder, and I've been pretty content in my role up to this point, and that makes it challenging. So let's say that this is the Fidelity app. You want to bring that in. You think that's a cool app, and you want that in your organization. The problem you're going to have is you're going to try and run the Fidelity app in this system, and it's not going to run. You're going to have to change your system. You're going to have to upgrade your organization to make the Fidelity app work. It won't work on an outdated system. It just doesn't. I love this quote. It comes from some folks at the National Implementation Research Network, a group of pioneering individuals who stopped talking about what works and started talking about how do we make what works work. It's a truism that current systems are perfectly designed to produce their current results. So if we're not getting results and the system doesn't change, it will produce the same results, right? They're perfectly designed to get their current results. So you've got to change the system in some way. This is kind of the same concept. The slide I showed you that looked like this was about building competency in frontline workers. By competency, I don't mean that the frontline worker isn't competent. It really means improved skill development. That's what we're talking about here. But this same concept applies to the organization. You've got to use these types of data-driven decision-making, an administration that's facilitating the Fidelity app working. You're going to have to engage in some systems interventions, and I'll tell you what that means. And the administration's going to have some performance measures as well that are related to outcomes. Forever what we've done is said our performance measure, what really matters is how many people we served. Well, this year we served, 250 more people than we did last year. We don't know if any of them are getting better. We don't know if any of them are still committing crime, but we did serve more, right? We've got to shift our focus as organizations and become be more outcome-driven, and you'll hear more about that today, I'm confident, as you go through the day. So, systems interventions. Let's talk about this for just a minute. Actually, before I do that, I think we've got time for this. I better see if I've got what I need here. If you've got a phone, let's see if I've got what I need. It was in here yesterday. I've got to get on a plane here soon, and so I've got my pretzels. There we go. All right. If you've got a phone with a flashlight, hold it up and turn it on, will you? All right. I'd ask you to wave it back and forth just to make me feel like I was a rock star, but I won't go. Well, thank you. Thank you. That makes me feel better. All right. Now, I want you to keep that phone up and your flashlight on if you paid more than $200 for that flashlight. If you paid more than $300, please keep your flashlight up. you paid more than $400 for your flashlight, please keep that up. If you paid more than $500 for your flashlight, well, that is an expensive flashlight. Okay, thank you. Okay, well, so here's my flashlight. This costs $10. I think you overpaid. Frankly, I think you might have overpaid for your flashlight. We looked at what we were paying our supervisors, not what we were paying, but the collective amount that we were paying supervisors. Weber Human Services spends about $1.2 million annually on mid-level supervisors. Now, the device you just held up is not really a flashlight, right? You can use it as a flashlight, but what does that do to the device? Okay, it's going to use the battery, right? It's going to drain it for what it was really intended for, which is what? Okay, serving the internet, good. It tends to be used as a communication device, right? That's what you purchased it for. You can use it that way, but that's not exactly what you want. Well, that's what we found out we were doing with supervisors. With our supervisors, we could use them to do lots of things in our organization, but how much of what they were doing mattered to clients? How much of that was producing outcomes for clients? So we're spending a lot of money on having that role do something that it really was designed to do something else, and that was help clinicians improve their practice so that clients get better. So here's the newest supervisor at your organization. She's bright, she's enthusiastic, she comes in with a real drive and a desire to make a difference in her role as a supervisor within the organization, and we start to do this to the supervisor, right? Here's what we do to that supervisor. We start loading them up with all kinds of organizationally sustaining behaviors. Behaviors that sustain the organization but have no real impact on outcomes. And then we say to them, oh, by the way, I went to this conference, they talked about fidelity evaluations, and so we need you to start doing that. Well, when and where would you like me to do that, right? This is the systems intervention piece. The system around this supervisor has to change. There's got to be a clearing of her plate to make this work. If this is important along with all those other things, it's just not going to get done. And so we recognized that with supervisors, and we went in and tried to clear their plate a little bit. I'm not going to speak to each of these. This was the systematic intervention that occurred within our organization. But one of the most significant things we did was go through a process of looking at what our supervisors do and then saying to them, what could we shift up to your boss? What could your boss do that you now do so that you don't have to do that anymore? How happy were their bosses at taking that on? Well, they were willing, and that mattered. What can we do to shift down? Are there some things that, for example, our customer care staff could take from you that would free up your time? What could we reduce that you really kind of enjoy doing but isn't tied to outcomes? And what could we eliminate? And that became our mantra: shift up, shift down, reduce, eliminate. It was a systematic intervention within our organization to allow fidelity processes to begin to work. And we were measuring how much time does a supervisor spend on clinical quality. So in the early stages, this is how much time. We had set a goal to have our supervisors spend about 10 hours of time every week in clinical quality, which amounts to what? 1/4. That's it. 25% of your time we want spent on clinical quality, on fidelity evaluations, on coaching and supervision. That's what we want. And at this point, as we were measuring in 2013, we were getting about 3 hours per supervisor, right? Even though they understood everything we've talked about and had indicated very much a willingness and a desire to do it, they wanted to, they just had nowhere to put it, right? So we then engaged in this process that I talked about, shift up, shift down, reduce, eliminate, several other strategic interventions within the organization. And here's what happened a year later. And a year later, we reached that point where we saw a lot more of this clinical quality time being spent by supervisors, right? And we're seeing these fidelity evaluations that are happening consistently. So this was 2015. These are the number of fidelity evaluations that occurred at Weber Human Services in 2015. You can see we've got 10 evidence-based practices that we're doing in a sustainable way. We won't adopt an evidence-based practice without a very thorough kind of vetting to see if we can do it. It might be world's greatest thing, but if we can't do it and we can't sustain it, we're not going to start it. There's no sense in that, right? We've wasted tons of money and time starting new evidence-based practices that we could never sustain. So, and some of that has to push back to the purveyors. If you're doing something in a research setting that works, but no one can do it in a frontline setting because it's too complicated, well, who cares, right? It just doesn't matter. They've got to get good at saying, how can organizations sustain something that works and help us do that? But we've got 10 evidence-based practices going on, so there were 362 fidelity evaluations that were done on everything but MI, motivational interviewing, which is an evidence-based practice. You can see that there were 254 fidelity evaluations. That's down by about a third from the year before. So remember that comment I said the only thing harder than getting there is staying there? Yeah, it's tough. And you've got to use the data to kind of drive this and help you recognize where we're at. You can also see that we listen to what we refer to as generic sessions. Routine care, treatment as usual. And we try and provide feedback rather than just, again, this kind of storytelling. We want to really kind of give some feedback on that. And you can see the agency total, nearly 1,000 fidelity evaluations for 2015. And again, that's down by about a third. And we're working on some processes. We just met with supervisors for a full day to try and work out what do we need to improve, what can we do better at in this process. So what? Then the question is, so what? Well, we don't have a lot of ways of measuring everything that we do. We're getting better at that. In fact, we've got a couple of people here at the University of Utah, Matt Davis and Mike Tanana, who are helping us develop a process to understand our data better and our outcomes. But we do have some outcomes. So the state of Utah, we administer the OQ, at least to all clients who come in with a mental illness. We administer the OQ weekly, and every mental health center in the state does this. It's been doing it since 2009, and the division then reports outcomes to us so that we can understand our outcomes. And what we saw is a trajectory over the past 3 years of our outcomes doing this. A process they've kind of flattened, to be honest. We're trying to figure that out. That's why we've got Matt and Mike involved. But you can see that on the adult side, we've nearly doubled the statewide average in terms of clients at discharge who are either improved or in recovery versus those who deteriorated or stayed the same. So we're seeing some good progress in that area. We've led the state for several years, and I don't say that in a bragging way. I say that in a way of saying we want to know if people are getting better. And here are our youth outcomes. I can tell you that treating youth with mental illness is a much better prospect than treating adults who've had several episodes of mental illness throughout their life, right? That's why we want to treat people early. That's a different subject than recidivism. But you can see that, again, here in the youth area, we're seeing nearly 2 out of every 3 clients is leaving in recovery or with improved symptoms. And again, the trajectory has been really good for our organization over the last several years. So we're winding down here, and we'll have some time for questions. I want to introduce one last concept to you, and that is the idea of dosage. You can take what works, any evidence-based practice, You can do it to fidelity and have all kinds of fidelity measures built in and training processes and coaching processes. But if clients only get a portion of what works done well, it doesn't really matter. This dosage issue is huge. We've developed an internal schema, a process for rating programs internally within our organization to help us recognize how they're doing, not just at quality, but how much clients are getting of that quality evidence-based practice. And right now we think about 1 out of every 3 clients who gets an evidence-based practice gets it in enough dose to make it worthwhile and meaningful for them. So this is the next frontier. We've got to flip these numbers. We've got to take what works. We start there every time. We need to do it well. We need to build in fidelity measures, and we need to be able to help people get better at their skill set in delivering it. And then we need to be sure that those offenders who get that service get it at a sufficient dose to make a difference in what's going on. So I think that summary slide, fidelity monitoring is as much a part of success as the intervention themselves. These processes can build confidence and mastery in clinicians and a sense of pride in their work. To do it, your organization's going to have to change. It's not impossible. It takes effort. It takes an administration who's committed, but they can do it. So we're going to take questions here. They want us to pass around a mic. And so there's a question right over here. And we'll go ahead and take some questions here for a few minutes.
Darin, can you tell us how the clinical supervision changes for the clinical supervisor from the time they're in their first 2 years working towards an independent license, and then after they've had that license, what do your clinical supervisors do differently, either quantitatively or qualitatively?
Okay. So I want to be sure I understand your question correctly. You talked about clinical supervisors getting their license, and I want to be sure.
The supervisee getting their license during that first 2 years is pretty intensive.
Yes.
Later on, it may back off, but it still needs to be there, so I'm wondering how they handle that.
Thank you. That's a great question. So his question is, if I come into the organization new and I'm trying to get my license, I'm getting fully licensed, there's a requirement that I get so many hours. Well, we have built a supervisory, a supervision dosage plan into our work at Weber Human Services. So we far exceed Doppel's requirements. If you're in your first year at Weber Human Services, whether you're right out of school or you got 10 years, you're going to get 8 supervision sessions a month, 4 individual and 4 group supervisions. So twice a week you're going to do that for the first year. It backs off a little bit after your first year, but ultimately, over time, even after 2 years, that person will participate in supervision 4 times a month, 2 individual and 2 group supervisions for the rest of their career at Weber Human Services. And in that, again, we want to provide direct observation processes and those kind of things that help us build skill. But yeah, they'll continue to get a high dose of supervision, and that was a change, right? Our administration had to say, well, this is going to be an investment of money. We don't get paid for supervision. That's non-billable, right? So the agency has to be committed to this process, and that is a great question. So they continue. After that first 2 years, they get 4 supervision sessions, 2 individual per month, and 2 group supervision sessions per month that they participate in. And we see them as participating as collaborative, as bringing to the table things that will, they're not just there to receive, expert practice, they're contributing in ways that matter. We see them as meaningful contributors to this. That's why we do group supervision. We didn't used to do any group supervision, and that was a big leap for us. So I hope that answers the other questions that you might have. Right over here.
I'm just curious about turnover. Like, I don't know about you, but there's a lot of turnover. Like therapists work for a couple years and they transfer somewhere else, and even within agency and out of agency. What do you guys do in regards to turnover?
It's a great question. It's really a two-part question. Number one is you've got a plan for turnover. That's why you adopt evidence-based practices that you can continue to train in. Either they have a train-the-trainer process, or it's financially feasible to keep training in it because you are going to have turnover. And then the second thing I would say about turnover is that we had, so when the economy bottomed out in 2008, between about 2008 and 2013, frankly, we had very little turnover within our organization. From 2013 to 2015, we saw substantial turnover, and we think a lot of that had to do with the economy, and we track this internally. But I can tell you that absolutely, without question, we had people leave our organization because of this. That's why they left. Absolutely, without hesitation, I can tell you that we have had people come to our organization because of this. So it's a double-edged sword. This isn't for everybody, and our hiring practices have changed dramatically. We're not as interested, we are interested, but we're not as interested in a person's experience and knowledge as we are in things that are really unteachable. How coachable is this person? How open are they to continuous learning in their work? That really matters because they're going to be happy. It's going to be a good fit with our organization. And it's not a good fit for everybody, and we get that. We understand that. And we're not trying to push anybody out. We're trying to get good outcomes for our clients. Question right up here and then over here.
So you talk about outcomes for clients, and you talked about dosage, and in corrections we respond to a lot of non-compliance, and we try to do that in a way that is best for the client. But what I'm wondering about is, considering fidelity, is it possible to increase the dosage and actually harm the client in terms of saturation, in terms of them losing motivation, and a lot of other things that could happen by I guess, in a way, overdosing them?
I agree. I mean, you reach a point with clients where, and offenders, where you've thrown so much at them as a means of changing behavior that in and of itself can start to become a barrier, and they drop out of treatment because I've got 4 appointments over here and 3 over here, and I can't miss, and if I miss, I get in trouble, and they just begin to get hopeless. And I think it's a real issue that we have to pay attention to, and we have to recognize and think about how we stack our interventions. What do they need most up front? And this is going to be, this is the responsivity principle at play here to a degree also. If I've got a serious mental illness and I've got a lot of anxiety, and you say, hey, MRT groups twice a week, and I'll be there, I'll be reporting to your probation officer, but we don't address the anxiety for that person on some level, we're setting them up. And if we're not addressing some practical problems for clients, transportation, other barriers, we're setting them up to get back into the system. It's a real problem. I don't wish I had a great answer, but I don't.
Well, unfortunately, they can't drop out of prison.
So it's a good point.
A different part of the institution has become get back into general population, where all of those risk factors are going to just decrease for them.
It's a great point. We've got a lot to learn about the delivery of correctional interventions in community settings. And that's the argument sometimes. We'll send them back to prison. They can't drop out of that. But it's so much more expensive, and it's putting somebody who's, got a serious illness back in touch with a bunch of people who have the same thing, and it's contagious. And so, yeah. So I think there was one right here, and then we'll go over here.
What kinds of training or support or supervision do you find your mid-level managers needing
that's a
in
great
order
question.
to feel confident and enjoy their job?
So that is a great question. And I don't know that we've completely answered that. So we bring in a new evidence-based practice, and our supervisor is being trained at the same time as everybody else, right? And so he or she is learning this, and now they're trying to provide feedback in it. One of the things that we've really committed ourselves to is this, that anytime we train in an evidence-based practice, we provide ongoing contact for the supervisor with the developers of that evidence-based practice over time. If there's a certification process, we for sure want that supervisor certified, and we want them to go through it. It's come at an expense, but we have them have contact on an ongoing basis with the developers to develop their own expertise. But we've also told supervisors, you don't have to be the best. You know, Phil Jackson was not a better basketball player than Michael Jordan, but he still coached him. You don't have to be the best. You just have to know it when you see it, and you have to know it when it's not being done, be able to give feedback. In addition to that, just that one slide I had about, you know, what the supervision structure is and the strategies. We meet twice a month with supervisors. We practice together this feedback process, so they continue to participate in some processes of learning how to give feedback, how to help clinicians progress. We don't think we've mastered it, but boy, that is a spot-on question in terms of what has to happen organizationally. There's another question over here. I think we've got maybe one or two. Yeah, Sean.
Is this on? Yeah. So many of our training institutions, our funders, our regulators have been very focused for the last 20 years on person-centeredness, client-driven. Now we're shifting or incorporating evidence-based practice that are at times very prescriptive, manualized. How do you deal with that discrepancy, that tension?
Another really good question. Wow, we got the right people in the room here. So there are two thoughts to that. Number one is this, is that our organization can only change to the degree that our funding organizations are willing to come in and look at the right things in our organization. That matters a lot. I pay attention to that. If I'm one of the directors of an organization and I'm responsible for the funding that comes in, and these people are going to come audit me on A, B, C, and D, none of which have any ties to outcomes but are well-intentioned, but aren't tied to outcomes, what am I going to pay attention to? I'm going to drop this, and we're going to focus on this. I can tell you this was a calculated risk for our organization to go down this road. But in addition to that idea of person-centered versus this manualized process, I have truly spent a lot of time, I guess that's the easiest way to say it, studying what works, reading it. I'm not interested in somebody's interpretation of what works. I want the study, and I want to read it. I don't want you to tell me what the study said. I'm looking at the bottom of people's slides, and I'm writing down the study. I don't care what you said about the study. I want to read the study. And so I have done a deep dive into what works. And I can tell you that the reason that what works is because it's person-centered. Built into the evidence-based practices is a responsivity piece. I could give you several examples of this. I'll give you one. I do a lot of work with aggression replacement training. It's a great evidence-based practice for juvenile offenders. At one point of the manualized process, in the group, you go to each individual in the group and say, where do you need this skill for you individually? Not, hey, we're all going to practice the same thing. I don't care if it's meaningful to you. I don't care if it matters, but this is the skill and this is what we're going to do. We're going to practice it. That's not how it works. Built into almost every evidence-based practice I've ever studied is a process for individualizing it. And so I think that's been a misconception of evidence-based practices. They're cookie cutter. You're just going to do this, this, and this. That's not truly how most evidence-based practices work. So thank you for your time today. Thanks for this opportunity. Good luck in your work. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
All right. Thank you, Darin. going to take a break. At 11:30, you can come back in. We'll get started for one more session, and then we'll be having lunch.
Is there an eject button on this? Oh, sure.